Hello and welcome to the VSC podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma, or those who have experienced violence, and have conversations about social issues. My name is Jenarine, my pronouns are she, her, and I am the Violence Prevention Educator at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. In this podcast, we discuss sensitive topics such as violence and sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace, or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. For the Florida State Sexual Helpline, call 888-956-7273. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There is always someone ready to help. In today's episode, I have with me Nicola Prichard, who is one of VSC's amazing victim advocates, and Ralph Reinert, who is VSC's Volunteer of the Year. Today we'll be speaking about repressed trauma, and since Ralph is a childhood sexual abuse survivor who has experienced repressed trauma, he is here to share his story and his healing journey, while Nicola will be sharing a more clinical insight. So without further ado, let's get to it. Ralph and Nicola, thank you so much for being here today. So as I mentioned in the beginning, today we're going to be speaking about repressed trauma. And Nicola, I want to start off with you, because since you are a victim advocate and crisis counselor, you work with trauma day in and day out. So can you explain what repressed trauma is and how it differs from other forms of trauma?
So, repressed trauma, it's actually a very controversial subject when it's kind of phrased as repressed trauma, because there are different definitions of what repressed trauma is. So, that's the Freudian kind of definition that there's this complete inhibition of like awareness. You don't know that this memory exists, it's completely gone out of like, and it's kind of this subconscious process. And then there are some other theories that I'll get into more in the later of this podcast, but the one thing about trauma that we don't remember, or trauma that's not kind of accessible to us readily, is that there can be this added element of kind of questioning yourself of, these memories come back and you haven't had these memories, and it can feel like, am I making this up? Is this a real memory? So there's often those times where people wondered, like, is there more that they don't remember? So it creates this kind of uncomfortability with like trusting the memory, trusting that they've remembered everything, trying to remember things, but then also not trying too hard to remember things that aren't real. So there's just kind of a lot of uncertainty with it. So that can be hard sometimes. And then because sometimes, and in the past, and I know in like the 80s, I think it was the 80s, it was kind of a big topic of how repressed trauma isn't real. And there was the whole, I guess we can get into this more later, but there was a lot of things to do with like planting memories and things like that came out. So I think another thing that differs from other kinds of trauma is we already have a lot of people who question survivors when they come forward with, even if they didn't have any repressed or forgotten kind of memories of trauma. But then when it's like someone says, well, I actually didn't know about this trauma until I was like 30 years old, people are like kind of skeptical, because they're like, how can you forget something traumatic, even though it's absolutely possible. And like, if you look at neuroscience, it makes a lot of sense why those things can kind of happen and the suggestions for that. But sometimes it can add that extra feeling of like, no one's going to believe me because I didn't remember this for a long time. And so that's kind of another way that it differs from other trauma.
Thank you, Nicola. Ralph, can you tell us a little bit more about your personal experience with this trauma? Nicola, I know you mentioned that repressed trauma has the stigma associated with it. Is there a different term that we can use throughout this podcast that will not exactly like stigmatize that word?
So not necessarily. I don't know that there's a consensus among the psychological community.
Okay.
Because technically it depends on I use the term repressed trauma, but I'm not necessarily Freudian, so I don't necessarily use it in that sense of that definition of the word repressed, more so in the terms of like, I come from more of like a cognitive psychology background myself. So from that standpoint, repressed trauma. So I think it just, you can still use the term. It just, there's
Being
inherently
aware.
some,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So going back to Ralph, can you tell us a little bit more about your personal experience with repressed trauma and when you first became aware of it?
She was spot on, by the way. I was one of those that had no idea that I was abused when I was a child until I was in my 50s. And along the way, due to that, I was very quiet. Um, I questioned things. I had no trust. I didn't trust pretty much anybody. And the part that was really tough is quietness. People looked at that as anger, as being angry just because you were quiet. When you don't remember one bit of your childhood and you go to someone's house and they what do they talk about? When I was a kid, I did this or that. So you sit there and being just back off. Boy, what's wrong with Ralph? So, but as my mind started to be aware, it was things like, was that a memory or was it something my sister told me? Because I lost most of my childhood. I didn't remember my hugs from my mom and going on vacations and playing out in the street with I knew it happened because when I shared everything with my siblings, they started sharing with me to kind of give me a little bit of where I was when I was a kid. But it's so frustrating because you really don't know if it's real, and then along the way, the nightmares and the dreams and people, it's really weird, is people with no faces, and it's like, well, what's going on? And by the way, I've been in therapy for 20 some years, so along the way I learned all these different tools to work with all this. But I also, and it was explained to me, that when your brain does that, because it was so horrific, that it also blocks out other things. Like, I have very little remembrance of my 4 years in the Marine Corps. Part of it overseas, which you don't really want to remember, but it's other things too. Like, I knew I was in the Philippines, but I don't have a clue what it looked like. I can't remember being there. I had a top secret clearance. I knew kind of what I did, but it's just, oh, okay. I look back at things in my when I went to Paris Island. I have a book from there, and I look at that, and I kind of remember faces, and so it just affects you in so many ways. Of and we'll go into triggers later, but it's there, but you're really not aware emotionally, but physically you are, and that affects your emotions. I hope that answers your question.
That did answer my question. Thank you, Ralph. So, Nicola, like you mentioned, when it comes to neuroscience, when it comes to trauma, it is possible for someone, and Ralph is a testament to this, to forget what happened to them. So, in that lens, in the neuroscience lens and cognitive memory lens, how is it possible for someone to not remember a traumatic memory?
So, and I apologize because this is going to be a long and involved answer. I'm just going to tell you that up front.
Please go ahead.
But
We are okay with that.
you kind of have to look at one, how memories form in the brain. So traumatic memories are very different to regular, run-of-the-mill memories of like your everyday things. And if you think about like how you got to work this morning or how you drove home, you kind of have this narrative of like, first I did this, then I drove here, then I did this. And it's like a step-by-step progression. That's for like the normal memories. For traumatic memories, a lot of the time what we're seeing is that it's this fragmented, very sensory memories where it's not necessarily a narrative. So you're just getting these bits and pieces of, and sometimes it might not even seem like it's related. Like some people will remember like a specific corner of a wall, and maybe that's what they were looking at when the trauma was happening, and it's not necessarily remembering the trauma itself, but that's what the brain encoded because it was just this kind of sensory picture. Or sometimes smells, because smell is a very kind of primitive sense. It doesn't go through all the same systems as some of our other senses. That one as well can be a very big trigger for people because it takes them right back there. And so you have these kind of fragmented memories that don't create this strong narrative. Some people do. Like some people have a very strong narrative of exactly what happened to them. And so it's not necessary to say it as a blanket statement. This is just very common to see these kind of fragments. And so sometimes then you get into these issues of how that gets encoded. So it doesn't necessarily get encoded into long-term memory the same way that other memories do. So then it kind of gets stuck. And that can also be why a lot of people who have experienced trauma, that trauma logically, they know is in the past, but to the body feels like it's happening right now because that memory is kind of stuck. It hasn't quite made it into the long-term memory. And so with repressed trauma or forgetting trauma, it seems very counterintuitive, but it kind of, there's a whole lot of stuff going on in the brain when you don't want to remember something, or when it depends on kind of the circumstances for the specifics. But just to go over like a general kind of what right now are the theories. Obviously we discussed there's Freudian theories of how some memories are too overwhelming for us, so our brain, to protect ourselves, kind of pushes them into our subconscious and we don't remember them. We have kind of no recollection of it. And some people do, they have a complete forgetting of the trauma. From a cognitive psychology perspective, a lot of that can be explained by very common processes that our brain has, but that are maladaptively applied to these memories. So when we look at, they came up with, I think it's called a think, no think paradigm, where they did studies with people where they would give them a list, and some of them they would be told to think about and be able to recall something afterwards. And the other ones, they were given the list, but they were told, don't think about these, like actively do not think about these. And then they looked at kind of how the brain reacts in those situations. And you can see there's a lot of hippocampal activity that goes on when you're told not to remember something. And so we see that the hippocampus, which is it's essential for basically encoding episodic memories, which episodic memories are those narrative kind of, these are things that happened to me in my life, not just like basic facts of the world. So when people are actively not thinking about something, the hippocampus actually has reduced activity, but to the point that if you looked at someone's brain while they were looking at a blank screen, and then you looked at their brain while they were trying not to think about something, there's less hippocampal activity when they're trying not to think about something. So those systems are kind of like shut down entirely. And this isn't necessarily to say that it's someone sitting there thinking like, I'm not going to think about this. It's like your brain is going to do it. Because as we said, like some of these memories are really distressing or overwhelming for people. So obviously they're going to try not to think about it. And that kind of kicks your brain into that mode. And so people can actually, in a way, willingly kind of reduce that activity. And same for the amygdala, which is very involved in the emotional processing of memories. And so a lot of the time when there's kind of that need to not think about something because of how distressing it is, the amygdala also kind of pulls back and it decreases that negative reaction. So then it becomes this kind of whole thing where we're disengaging regions of the brain due to these memories that are kind of like overwhelming. But now you've gone through all that, there are a couple of things where these are just things that people do in everyday life, but they get applied to these memories that are traumatic. Because at the end of the day, traumatic memories are still memories, and your brain can still process them in some ways similarly. So one kind of possible explanation is something traumatic happens, and then for a long period of your life, you don't really have those retrieval cues. And so retrieval cues are those things that help us bring up the memory. So for some people, let's say they moved away from the place, or maybe they don't see the perpetrator anymore, and they don't kind of have anything that's really bringing up that memory for them. Maybe they were young in age. The brain isn't going to necessarily bring those memories up because it's not relevant. And obviously, this is with the huge caveat of this is different if someone has something like PTSD and they cannot get that memory away. This is for like someone who doesn't have that kind of pathology right now. So sometimes later on in life, they may see something or read something and they get that retrieval cue, and then it comes back to them. And it's kind of just like this realization that they have of this memory because they finally got that retrieval cue. So that's one of the kind of theories of how that can happen. Another one is relabeling. So for some children, when they are abused in their childhood, as a child, you may not necessarily understand what that is, and you may not label it as abuse because you don't have that information. You may know that it feels uncomfortable and that it's bad, but you may not be thinking to yourself, oh, this is sexual abuse or this is physical abuse. So your brain doesn't really encode it as that. So it's kind of just this memory that you're like, oh, that was bad, and I don't know why. I really like, I'm not having a good time, like I'm really hurt by this, but you don't know why. So then later on in life, something, again, you may get a retrieval cue, and then something kind of clicks for you because now as an adult, you look back at that and you have a very different understanding of what that interaction was. So it kind of gets relabeled in your brain as like, oh, this was abusive. And so then that kind of brings back all those memories in a more accurate light for you. And so then, again, going back to this kind of idea of purposeful forgetting, which I don't love the term because it sounds like these people are like on purpose forgetting things, but it's more so your brain is purposefully doing it without, you don't have to like make a decision and be like, oh, I'm going to forget this. A couple of the ways we do that, just in our brain generally, is we like to do cognitive avoidance. And so one of the ways we do that is through selective rehearsal. So essentially, the more you rehearse something, the more you're going to remember it. So the more you talk about something over and over again, you're going to have a really good, strong memory of that happening. And so this kind of goes into one of the theories for why specifically sexual abuse, but really any kind of abuse, is most often seen in people who don't remember, because those kinds of abuses, you are told not to talk about it, and it's shameful. And, you know, a lot of times children, or mostly children, I guess, are afraid to talk about it. So we don't rehearse that. So then eventually the brain rehearses other things. So like, for example, let's say, and this is kind of going to get into just like a very brief description of an abuse situation, just to warn anyone, but let's say a child goes to summer camp, and while at summer camp, they're sexually abused, but they also have all these other memories that are a lot easier for their brain to handle. Because they're not telling anyone about the sexual abuse, and maybe they go home and their parents say like, how was summer camp? And they talk about, oh, I made this project and I did these activities. They're actively rehearsing those positive memories while not rehearsing the negative ones. So the brain is going to strengthen those memories while kind of putting that memory off to the side. And so that's one way that kind of happens. Another way is through, again, that retrieval inhibition of telling yourself not to think about it. And that actually starts to harm the memory that you have. It makes it harder to kind of pull that memory back up and remember accurately what's happening because of, again, shutting down regions of your brain. You can't actually encode that memory properly. And then kind of one of the last theories is infantile amnesia. So obviously children, you're not going to remember everything from your childhood. And there's a lot of things involved, like GABA, neuroscience stuff. It doesn't matter. But at the end of the day, sometimes that stuff gets grouped into the stuff that you forget as a child. So it's really not complicated in the sense of it's very possible for people to forget trauma, even though it's traumatic, because your brain is wired to forget stuff and remember other things. And so that's absolutely possible. As much as people think, like, emotionally, we think, how can you forget something so traumatic and it was so bad? There are lots of bad things that we forget on a daily basis. It doesn't make them less bad. It's just our brain can't necessarily keep that in our working memory all the time and handle that constantly. So this is a very long answer, but essentially to say there are many mechanisms that can help us forget something, especially if it's a negative memory. But kind of as Ralph was saying, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to feel the effects of it. You may not remember what happened exactly, but your body is still going to show some of those same signs that someone who remembers the trauma will show. So you'll still have some of those emotional difficulties, you'll have physical health problems that are associated with whatever the abuse was. You just aren't necessarily accessing that memory right now because of whatever reason it is.
I see. So you just briefly touched on my next question for you. So if you have anything else to add to it, that'd be great. And if not, that's okay too. So what are some common signs or symptoms, Nicola, that someone who may be feeling like they're having like these cues, like for example, like what was the word that you said? Retrieval cues? Is that what it was called? So maybe they're in a situation and their sensory mechanisms, they're like, oh my gosh, like this smell is familiar, or oh my gosh, like why it's kind of like deja vu in a sense. So what other common signs or symptoms can be shown, or can someone know or recognize that, hey, like I may be struggling with repressed trauma?
What I will say, and again, this kind of comes back to that controversy aspect.
Mm-hmm.
If I have a client who's kind of talking about how, like, they have big chunks of time that they don't remember and they're having all these symptoms of trauma, I won't necessarily say to them, well, maybe you have repressed trauma, because, and this is also just like a fact of the brain, it is relatively easy to suggest memories and for the brain to encode them like they're real memories. So as mental health professionals, we want to stay away from anything that's suggestive. So essentially letting the client come back to that memory on their own, and not push them to create anything. But again, as I said with Ralph, a lot of the signs of trauma, repressed or not, are pretty similar. So you'll have those behavioral cues that are telling you something's maybe not right. Maybe, like Ralph said, the nightmares. Well, you don't really know why you're having the nightmares, but you still have them, which is very similar to someone, even if they know they have trauma, they'll still have the nightmares. So it's those same kind of things, the nightmares, maybe bits of flashbacks that you'll have to something, but you're not quite sure what they are. Certain things being triggers for you, anxiety, depression. They're pretty much the same signs. You just don't necessarily remember why you're having them.
Mm-hmm. Ralph, can you explain the impact that your repressed trauma had on your mental and physical health?
Well, a couple things. I'll go back to what she had said. Smells. Um, I was walking down the street one time, and my wife had said to me, "Let's go to the right." My legs wouldn't move. I don't know if it was something I saw, a smell. I had no idea. Honest to God, they wouldn't. I couldn't. And things like I still have issues with smells. I don't know if this is for sure. You could tell me better, but I think I have asthma because of it. During my lifetime, I also had ulcerative colitis when I was really going through something that I didn't know what I was going through. Thank God that has went away. But it's called chemically induced asthma, where it's usually perfume, something like that, or a certain smell. But I think one of the biggest things is when you finally realize it, and I did know what happened to me that morning that I woke up and there it was right in front of me. Uh, People don't believe that. Most people, except therapists, of course. Um, but come on, you can't tell me, you're telling me that you went through this and you didn't have a clue. It's hard for people to understand. So that's a struggle in itself. And trust, learning to trust people was a real big deal. Still is, to where you question people more than you probably should about something, or um, but emotions. I had no emotions before I was healed. I mean, I just didn't. I don't know. I don't know how to explain it, but I didn't. Um, I didn't cry at funerals. I didn't get upset about things. And as I said to you, and another thing is, I cry at like sad commercials now because my mind is healed. And as things that we talked about before, as things come back, you do question them. Like uh, you had mentioned, you don't remember certain things. I can remember the staircase in the house, but I couldn't tell you what the kitchen looks like, the outside looks like. I used to walk to that house, but I couldn't tell you how I got there. I don't know what the street looked like, but I can remember going up the steps and the wallpaper. So, and as you both know, is not everybody's the same either. Everybody's brain's different. Everybody handles different. Um, and with my PTSD from being in the service, that's noise, but that's typical. But yet, it's still there. And Mary Ellen, when she opens a bottle of Prosecco, she has to warn me first. So, not the same thing, but you know what I mean? It's just all those things that you don't realize it's there until it's in front of your face, or you don't know why it's happening to you, or you don't know why you're having the nightmares, or why you think. But the good part is, as going through, I'm 75 now. So, it's been 20 some years that I've been being healed. And as your mind heals, it brings back little stuff. But that's when you question, was that from my sister or was that real?
Mm. I actually wanted to jump in on that. And that's a very good point. Our brain has a really difficult time discerning between things that we experience and things that someone told us. And that kind of goes back to the worries, I guess, that people have about repressed trauma is like maybe someone suggested this to them and now they think that this happened to them. And it really does a disservice to people who actually have these memories that they aren't able to access for whatever reason, and then it comes back to them. Kind of like Ralph said, people can't believe that that's possible. Um, and then that does make it hard because then when you're remembering, because things can still come up, you get a retrieval cue and maybe you're 20 years down the line and something else comes back to you. Um, but then you kind of have that question of, do I remember this? Is this real? Is this kind of just something I've heard? And that's very common, what Ralph is describing, to have that uncertainty about it because of how fragile memory is as a whole. Um, it can be really difficult to actually discern the difference, I guess. And even that can be distressing in itself because obviously a lot of people, like Rob was saying, don't believe it in the first place, and then you're kind of trying to make sure that it's real before you say something,
Right.
because you don't want to accidentally confirm, like, oh, okay, like maybe this was something someone told me, and there's that fear, even though there shouldn't be that fear, because it's like it's a very normal thing for the brain to do, but there's just so much stigma that it's almost just like scary to come forward and say, I remember this and I'm not sure where it comes from, but this is something that's come up for me, because then people will immediately be like, oh, you're probably just remembering something someone told you.
Hmm.
I was very fortunate to have parents that, were loving, caring parents that had no clue of what was going on, whatever. But my dad was a shutterbug. He took movies and pictures and pictures. And we all share them in my family. And it's like I look at it and I see me sitting on the front porch, but it's just a picture. I remember it so bad. But I also was taught, which you'll probably agree, is sometimes I try too hard to remember. And I had to stop doing that because, as my therapist said, by the way, her name is Linda Ritter. I owe my life to her. She said, don't try too hard. It'll mess it up. So I tried to back off a little bit.
Yeah, and that's a great point because it's, again, those memories that we can create for ourselves, it's really not hard. Like, it's scary how not hard it is to create a memory. And that's why a lot of the time we tell people, don't try, let it come to you. Let those retrieval cues come in and let it come up, and you can notice them and be like, oh, like this is coming up for me and I'm remembering this and I'm not sure where it's from. But if we try too hard, we can accidentally create these things where then we can't remember if we just thought maybe that's it, or was I remembering? And then it creates this kind of confusion. So that was a really good thing of how to tell you. And it's interesting that you say like watching these movies and seeing yourself is kind of like watching a movie of someone else. Like you were there, but it's like you might as well have not been there because it doesn't feel like you were even there. Which kind of relates to, I know you said that you were in the service, and that's an interesting point to me as well of kind of how the brain processes trauma. A lot of the time, that trauma can kind of be bundled together or connected in some way, even if it's completely unconnected. Like disconnected in real life, it kind of becomes connected through the way that the brain handles it. So a lot of the time we see this in like something happens that's traumatic, maybe someone was abused, and then they don't really think about it, they're not really affected by it, and then they get into like a minor car accident, which is traumatic, and then for some reason everything comes back up for them from all the abuse that they've had in the past, maybe like something that happened more recently. This one kind of smaller traumatic event kind of brings back everything. But in the same way, if we kind of reverse that concept, it's like you were saying about this early childhood memory was kind of pushed aside, but your brain did a whole blanket thing of like, let's just push everything aside. And so that kind of brings me back to that retrieval inhibition. Sometimes with reminders, we don't want to be reminded. So when something comes up, we'll push that away. And so we're actually not enhancing the memory. It sounds counterintuitive because you would think that the more reminders you get, the more you're remembering it. But it's kind of like the opposite is happening. The more reminders you get, the more you're like, let's push that away. And so sometimes the brain can do that a bit too much. And then you get these chunks of time where you just don't remember anything. And then when your brain, maybe you go into the service and you're in another traumatic situation, your brain is like, I recognize this feeling and I know what to do with this. So then it kind of goes into that, let's just put it away because that worked for us last time, kept us safe, according to your brain, which sometimes our brains have different ideas to us on what keeps us safe or what safe means. But so it pushes it aside, and then you get these big chunks of time, and memory loss is very common for people with trauma. And again, comes back to that hippocampus being completely deactivated sometimes. But yeah, I think everything that Ralph is saying is very common, especially for people with repressed trauma. If you look at, I don't want to say real cases because that makes me sound like I'm doubting, but not the cases that people cite when they're talking about like planting memories and how these kids made up being abused at a daycare, like not those ones, but like real people who just forgot about that trauma and it's coming back to them. A lot of the times you see a lot of similarities, kind of like, I know Ralph, you mentioned that you woke up one day and it kind of was just like there in front of you. Was there anything that was kind of a trigger or retrieval cue for you before that? Or was it kind of just you woke up one day and it was there?
No, it was as it was starting to hit me, and I would, for some reason, I didn't want to be around anymore. So I traveled a lot, and I would pick out bridge abutments along the way. It sounds kind of weird, but it was real life. And then what triggered it, another trauma, was one morning my wife said she was going to leave me, which was many times because she was bipolar, and we dealt with that for a lot of years, and she eventually did leave. But that morning, it was boom. And I remember my spouse told me that I took like 6 showers that morning. I was just curled up in bed. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to be touched. So that's how it happened. But
Yeah.
another trauma triggered that.
Yeah, that makes a lot
Something
of
that
sense.
came along. And I've been offered during my course for years ago, but I can, let's hypnotize you. Maybe you'll bring back some memories of the Marine Corps. So no, 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 no. I passed. I'm done. I have enough.
No, that's a really good point. There's this kind of debate as well that this is such a good point you've rolled up about, is it necessary to bring back those memories? Myself as a clinician, I'll be very open. I don't think it's necessary because
I agree, by the way.
oh, good. Because if you're doing okay, and maybe this is controversial, if you're doing okay, and I'm not talking about like maybe there's a situation where it's really affecting you, and without getting to that memory, you can't do the work. Even though we found ways like EMDR, for example, has been found to be very effective with people who don't necessarily remember the trauma because your brain remembers and you can kind of access that without you having to be like, here's what happened. You can kind of just think about that feeling. Um, Sometimes it does more harm than good, in my opinion, at least, to bring back these memories and to force yourself to kind of have that exposure to them. Well, if you can work on it and kind of develop, kind of like Ralph said, the tools that you need to manage that, and you're okay, why open Pandora's box and kind of bring that out just for the sake of kind of having it out in the open? It kind of ends up just, I find it very, I don't want to say scary because that sounds silly, but like kind of scary to do with clients because it's like you don't want to overwhelm their brains and their bodies with this remembering, and it can just sometimes be too much. But I also wanted to go back to what Ralph said about that feeling of like almost like just, I like that you kind of explained it as like an explosion of like you just remember. And that is super common for repressed memories of like, and actually something that's interesting too is that you said that it was kind of coming back to you and then you had this moment.
But
A
I
lot
didn't
of the
know why.
time,
I
yeah,
didn't know why. Right.
but you didn't know why. A lot of the time we call that like a partial forgetting. And it's not necessarily like, oh, you remember that like you were abused, but you don't remember the whole thing. It's like there are things that are like coming back to you, but you're not quite sure what they're on. You can't really like put your finger on why they're distressing or kind of like what they're connected to. And then when you get whatever retrieval cue, or kind of like you said, another trauma comes up and kicks into that, it's this like sudden remembering of like everything comes back to you. And that's super common. Which, I mean, and again, like you said, Ralph, everyone is different, but with cases where it's not a real kind of repressed memory and it is a situation where it's like implanted by a therapist, like from whatever back in the day, um, a lot of the time you don't get that kind of same thing. It's like very slow, like pulling these memories out. And that's not necessarily to say that someone who has that, it's not real. It's just a lot less common. A lot of the time it is kind of like that little buildup and then just immediately kind of it all comes back to you. That's super common with those kinds of memories.
Thank you both so much. That was for me on my end, that was like amazing to listen to, just to see how you both go back and forth with it, because Nicola, you're a clinician, so you're understanding Ralph as he explains his symptoms and his nightmares and his triggers. And Ralph, like hopefully Nicola is helping both of us, because I know I'm learning a lot,
Oh, absolutely.
understand.
She's, I mean, even though I've been in thousands of hours of therapy, I'm always open to learning more. And I did learn things today and really know how the brain worked, even though my therapist explained that to me and said this and that, whatever.
Mhm.
But it's always good to get that reinforcement saying, you're not really nuts. You were just abused.
So Ralph, you mentioned that you recognized your memories, well, pieces of your memory started coming back when you were in your 50s. So what were some of the challenges that you faced in the very beginning when these memories did come back and you realized, oh my gosh, this is something that did happen to me? So what challenges arose when you were trying to process the repressed trauma? And can you touch a little bit more on what encouraged you to go to therapy and to seek that help?
Well, I'm a very prayerful person. So uh, when it happened, it's like it's. I'm trying to think of how I want to explain this. I knew that when that came out, the explosion, and I knew that I needed help. And within a week, I was on the internet looking for somebody, and
Mhm.
I saw this lady's face in Naples, Florida, and clicked on it.
Mm.
And I just knew that was the person that I could. I don't know why, but you probably know why. But it was just this lady, and I picked her picture and I called her. And after all those years of being with her and her explaining to me, and it was just sometimes you leave and you're just burnt because you just opened up and just and it physically exhausts you. It
Mhm.
just and in the beginning of your journey, you want to try so hard to remember and you want to get all this stuff. And what it does is it closes in on you. It's like I was very fortunate to be able to fly in jets in the Marine Corps. So it's when you're going up and you're having G's and this black comes down like this and it just closes out. And then you go, and then you come back because the flight suit blows you up and gets you, your blood back in your head. It's almost, I don't know how to explain it, but it's almost like that to where some sessions I wanted to go on. And thank God my therapist never let me go on and on and on and on. It was time was up, it was up. But you want to just absorb more. And then there's other times when you're halfway through and you're done
Mhm.
because it's so physically, seriously, and emotionally draining that you're ready to go. And it's just it's very hard because again, with the situations I dealt with in my marriage and all, it was hard to have. Um, uh, by the way, she was there for me at times, but also at times she was not because of you know. Um, but when it wasn't, oh, that was even worse. When she would question, or she would say, "Really, are you really being healed?" And she would question stuff that I was going through, which probably shared too much at times. But it it was a tough journey at times. And then, but now doing this, I mean, you have no idea. As I explained to you, I think before, I don't do this volunteering for me anymore. I do it to give back because you can't do this if you're not healed, is my opinion, by the way.
Mhm.
Because in my life before this in South Carolina, I helped recruit people and sat down and interviewed them and all. And there was people that wanted to volunteer and be part of it, but they were doing it so they could get healed.
Mm.
And to help other people, you have to be healed. And I think the most rewarding thing to me is when my therapist told me, wow, you need to get out there and help people. So it was a good feeling. And that was when I started.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in to say that some of the stuff that Ralph is talking about is so important for people to know because sometimes people come to therapy and then they leave, and kind of that feeling you're talking about, Ralph, where you're like, oh my God, like I feel like my insides are out on the floor. Like that's just how you like a lot. We call that a vulnerability hangover sometimes, and sometimes we call
Mm-hmm.
it like a therapy hangover. Um, and it's very common, especially for more emotionally charged sessions that you do, maybe when you're getting deep into kind of the processing,
Mm-hmm.
you can feel really deflated after. And that's why those kind of self-care tools are really important to keep yourself going and kind of refresh for the next session. Um, but another thing that Ralph was talking about is that we call it like the window of tolerance. So maybe halfway through a session, you realize I'm way out of my window of tolerance right now. I need to take a step back, and you're kind of done. And then you come back, and as a clinician, when my clients get to that point, you bring it back and you do some less intensive work. because you want to stay within that window of tolerance so you're not overwhelmed. But sometimes when people don't know that's common, they feel like they're like failing therapy, like something's wrong and the process is like not working because they feel slightly worse than they did before they came in one session. They just feel like something's terribly wrong because physically you, like Ralph was saying, you physically feel drained. But that's super common and super normal for people to feel. So I'm glad you pointed that out for people to know.
But also, what I did is I always, and this might sound weird to you too, but you might understand, is I would schedule my therapy sessions at noon on my lunch break because I had a very stressful job. I ran a lot of things for a company. But what it did, it clicked me out of it. So when I'd go back to work, I had to be on my game. If I would have went home or would just sit there with my door closed, and but I have people coming in my office all the time and asking, it got me back in the swing
Mm-hmm.
of things a little bit, and that helped. And I took me a couple of years for me to realize that, but that worked for me.
Yeah, that distraction kind of was useful in that healing process.
Right.
Yeah, and that's important to know too. And you know, like you said, it sounds silly, but that is self-care. You going back to work was self-care for you. That's what it looked like. And that's
Right.
fine. And I always say to people, and I don't know, I'm kind of like a weird clinician. I love to be like the sillier it is, or the sillier it feels or sounds, the better, because it doesn't really matter to me. I have a very broad definition of self-care. So if Ralph was my client and he was like, I have to go back to work after this to like, that's going to really make me feel better, then that's great. Then we encourage that. As long as it's helping and it's not obviously not detrimental to like your health, um, that's perfect. And I think that's a good thing to bring up too, Ralph, is that that can look like anything. And people might feel silly doing some things, but that's fine. It can be silly. Do whatever you need to do.
Whatever works for you.
Exactly.
Nicola, as a clinician and as someone who's a crisis counselor and you work day in and day out with different clients, what are some potential challenges or obstacles that can arise based on your experience when working with individuals who are addressing their repressed trauma?
So Ralph has actually touched on a lot of it already. I would say one of the biggest challenges I would say is trying to either through, and again, I feel like I'm just repeating everything that Ralph said, but through psychoeducation of kind of explaining why is to not try too hard to remember. And as a clinician, kind of supporting them in that because it's hard not to want to remember because it's like obviously there's this huge thing and you want to be like just give me all the details so I can deal with it and you know process this. So that's a really difficult experience to go through if you're just kind of starting that journey and then as a clinician kind of trying to support that person through that and remind them that that's very normal, but it's also okay to take that step back and let your body do what it needs to do. And so trusting your body sometimes can be hard for people, especially because sometimes, and I guess I don't know if this is getting into a different kind of point, but sometimes it can feel like your body betrayed you in a way. Like,
Mm-hmm.
this thing happened to you, and, if you had remembered it years before, maybe you could have started working on it, kind of all these feelings of betrayal from your body. But then it's like now you're in the situation where you kind of have to trust that your body's going to work it out and bring it when it needs to. It can be kind of difficult to switch into that because it's like, well, I trusted you before and look at what you did.
Right.
Yeah, I
Um,
believe that God did this to me to when I could handle it. And back when I was, look at, when I was in my 1950s, whatever, they didn't have this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would have been suppressed. God knows what would happen to me. So I'm one of the fortunate ones, I feel, that it was there and it was given to me when I could handle it. And that Linda Ritter came up on my screen. That's what I believe.
yeah, and that's a good point too, is one of the challenges is finding, and sometimes people have issues with the term of like meaning making because, and again, it's not that I think that trauma has any positives necessarily. Like, I'm not going to sit here and tell someone that something that happened to them was actually good in the long run because at the end of the day, it wasn't good. But kind of like Ralph said, finding purpose for you. It doesn't matter if anyone else agrees. If for you, you feel like, you know what, this timing at the end of the day was right for me. And whether it's through spirituality, through just kind of deciding that it worked out in the end and like this works for you, getting to that point is really hard sometimes, and getting past the anger of not remembering. And I would say that's another one of the challenges. It can be hard to get to that point, and it makes me happy to hear Ralph kind of sound like he has some peace with kind of how that came about.
And I also, someone told me this, that, and I've thought about it a lot. I had a very successful career. I didn't go to college. I, finished my GED in Marine Corps, and I retired as a president of a national home builder.
Mm.
And somebody told me, and by the way, that's not a pat on my back. It's a it's because of what I went through that I had this drive unknowingly. I had this drive that just pushed me. Now, again, that doesn't happen to everybody. Some people go the other way. Thank God I didn't get into drugs and alcohol and all that. And I think about that sometimes, and I say, you know what? That could be right. I mean, like you said, sometimes something bad that happens leads to something good. And I don't know why I put it as I was in the right place at the right time, all this kind of stuff. But yet I went through all this stuff. And look how I ended up. Again, very thankful for it, whatever. But the person that told me was a good friend. And he says, which I shared my story with. And he said, Ralph, I really think that something there, something to that. So anyway.
Yeah. And I think sometimes linguistics can be, and I've actually done a podcast on linguistics, which makes me laugh, but sometimes for some people saying, because this happened to me, like you said, Ralph, like because this happened to me, I had this drive. That's empowering for you, it sounds like. And perfect. Like that's at the end of the day, that's what we want for people, is to feel empowered and to find meaning that works for them and helps them integrate that experience into who they are, but not kind of let that take over who they are. And something that I like to suggest for people as well who kind of feel like there's they don't want it to be because of that experience, because that's what happened to them isn't them and they did that on their own. I sometimes like to just do it. It's a slight change, but it's like you did this in spite of what happened to you. You had that drive, that need, that strength to kind of do all these things in spite of the fact that someone did this to you. And so sometimes that helps people too. But usually I'll go with whatever is most empowering. So if it's because of that, then it's because of that. If it's in spite of it, it's in spite of it. It doesn't matter. It's essentially the same idea of these were strengths that you had and that you utilized after a situation that was objectively bad, and no one should be telling you it wasn't bad, but and just kind of acknowledging those strengths that you've had. And again, it makes me happy to hear Ralph kind of talking about these accomplishments that he's had, and acknowledging those strengths, because at the end of the day, like the healing process is up to the person who's healing. Therapists can do all this work with you and kind of guide you through that, but like Ralph did that work for himself. And that's, I always like for all of my clients, that's where the credit lies. I was here, I was guiding, fine, I'm okay with that term, but at the end of the day, their healing is what they did. And Ralph, like, I love seeing people come to that place of they've found kind of purpose, meaning, and kind of it seems like, at least, I don't want to speak for you, Ralph, but that's been integrated for you. And it's just really good to hear about that.
Well, and also in bringing this forward is, for a long time, I didn't talk, and a lot of people don't talk about what happened when you're in the Marine Corps in bad places. And I was embarrassed. I was ashamed at times. And again, because of my trauma, I just felt bad and whatever. In the last couple of years, I made a shadow box with all my accomplishments in the Marine Corps on it. And I put it in my hallway. I would have never done that years ago. But now, you know what? I'm proud of it. And it just makes you feel better.
I love that.
And for what it's worth, Nicole and I are so proud of you, Ralph. Like even sitting here, my like heart is just filled with like so much, oh my gosh, like admiration for you as well, because Nicola's right. You're the one that put in the work. And we're so grateful for Nicola as well, because Nicola, you what you do day in and day out is you help these clients, through their healing journey. And Ralph, you're the one that did the work. So
Yeah,
both,
but
this
you
is like
guys are
a
pretty damn
proud
awesome
moment for me. I'm
yourselves
like,
too.
yay.
You
And I do
Yous
want
are awesome also. Yous are both awesome. Let me get that in there. Yous are both awesome also.
Uh-huh.
And I'm really proud of what yous do.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I want to
I
say,
actually,
oh,
oh,
go ahead.
sorry. I wanted to bring up another, as I was saying something, it kind of like sparked something. This is going back to, I know I like took us off course like 8 times, but going back to another one of the potential challenges is sometimes if the memory is about a caregiver, or someone who is a parent or someone that they relied on for basic survival needs as a child, which is also another kind of theory behind why people forget things. So this is kind of going full circle, but um, the betrayal trauma theory kind of looks into why it's necessary for survival sometimes to forget the trauma. Because let's say it's a parent who takes care of you and this is happening, it's not actually adaptive in your brain as much as obviously everyone outside of that child recognizes that it would be adaptive for them to get out of that environment. For them in survival mode, it makes sense for them to just not remember it and just kind of move on like it didn't happen because they need to be taken care of. And so sometimes when, let's say, an adult now comes to therapy and that this has come back to them, sometimes there can be that resistance because trauma and abuse, none of it is this simple black and white, like, oh, you hate this person now. Sometimes you have those ambivalent feelings of, yes, you hate what that person did to you. And sometimes you have that anger and you're like, I hate this person. I want them to go to prison. And that's fine. But sometimes there is that other part of you that grew up caring about that person. And it's hard to just kind of get rid of that. So there is this ambivalence kind of or difficulty in separating that. When you're remembering these things and processing it, sometimes it can be hard because it's like admitting that this person who you care about hurt you. And that adjustment to that narrative can be really hard sometimes. And so that just came up for me as like another pretty big obstacle actually when working with this.
One of the things, and I think it's a problem for some people, me especially, is the thing where you hear, you have to forgive to be totally healed. Well, in my opinion, that's total BS. Because I'll be very honest, I've prayed for that person, but I'll never forgive them for what they did to me because they really screwed up my life. And that's okay for me. For some people, it might be. Now, I don't dwell on it. I don't, you know what I mean? It's like,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think I'm ever there. And it nags me a little bit because, people say, well, you have to forgive. You hear from people that are really, what would Jesus do? All that. I'm sorry. I'm not him. I'm not as strong as he was. So it's a tough one. And I think that's might be an issue for other people too, because I don't think I'm the only one. But that's something that still nags me every once in a while. Ralph, maybe. And I still say, no, not yet.
Yeah, and that's such a good point. That is, you're absolutely not the only one who struggles with that. And I think sometimes it comes back to the way that forgiveness is kind of talked about, kind of like you said. A lot of people say, oh, like you have to, you're not fully healed until you forgive because forgiveness, like, what is it? Not forgiving someone or something is like drinking poison and waiting for someone else to
Oh
die is
yeah.
the thing,
Yeah, yeah,
which
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah, yeah.
fundamentally disagree with
No.
because I feel like that is more so resentment. Fine, if you want to say that
Yes.
about resentment, that's fine. There's a difference between having that kind of like you said, Ralph, you're not actively dwelling on it, you're not overcome with resentment all the time. That's very different to forgiveness. And forgiveness, I am kind of on the same page as you, Ralph, in terms of to me, if forgiveness is important to you as my client and you feel like that's what you need to be healed, then that's
And
fine. We will
right.
go along that road. But if you come to me and you're like, you know what? I'm not bothered by not forgiving this person. I'm never going to do it. That is great. Then we move on from that because you don't need it. Forgiveness looks different to everyone.
You're the only
And
one that ever really told me that, by the way. Thank you.
oh no, don't.
Aw.
Because that's, I love to say that forgiveness, that I'm never going to define forgiveness for any of my clients and what that means to them because that's so personal. And that decision, it's not on me to say, well, you should forgive this person. I'm not involved. I have nothing to do with it. What right do I have to say that you should forgive someone? And at the end of the day, you can not forgive someone and it's not really affecting you to not forgive them. That's fine. Then don't forgive them. That's good. And for some people, that's empowering to say, you know what, you will never have my forgiveness. And I'm going to live the rest of my life and I'm going to be fine and I'm going to, be healed or be healing from this, but I'll never forgive you. And if that's empowering, let's go. And I know, Ralph, you said that you're not as strong as Jesus to not forgive someone, but you're plenty strong. It also takes strength to stand up and say, you know what, I'm not going to forgive someone. And I'm okay with that because it's so against that popular narrative of this is something you have to do. And it's almost like, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but it's almost kind of made out to be like you can only be strong and virtuous if you forgive. Like not forgiving in some way makes you less strong or makes you less virtuous as a person. It doesn't mean anything. It's at the end of the day, you were not the one who abused someone. And that to me, I'm like, that's enough. You've done enough as a person. You're good.
Me and my therapist,
So,
we had a pact. We decided not to talk about it. So
yeah, it's like,
it's how we dealt with it.
yeah, because it's like you don't have to do it. And it frustrates me sometimes because it does, like Ralph said, it can kind of get to you sometimes. People saying, well, you have to though. And then you start to kind of question yourself and be like, well, should I, like, is it necessary? When it's like, no, you don't. It's just people love this idea of, you see on the news all the time, oh, this person's family member got murdered, but they forgave the person and it's kind of looked at as like just incredible. And yeah, it is incredible. And all the power to them if that's what is empowering for them, but that doesn't mean that's right for everyone. And at the end of the day, it should just be what is individually empowering for you.
Thank you.
So my last question for both of you today, and I'll tailor it to each of you individually. So Nicola, for someone who's listening to this episode right now and is in the process of uncovering and processing their own repressed trauma, what is one thing that you would recommend them to do?
Ever since Ralph said this, I'm like, this is what I would say. Don't try too hard. And it sounds so like oversimplified. And I don't want it to sound mean, like I'm being like, don't think about it. But it's like, don't put that strain on yourself for a process that is kind of out of your control in that sense. Because your brain's going to remember when it wants to remember. And sometimes even if you don't have the retrieval cues, you can't remember it. So you can't force yourself, and it adds extra stress. So I would say don't try too hard. But I'm going to say a second one and break the rule. Find what works for you individually. And this is kind of just speaking about everything that Ralph and I kind of mentioned. Find what works for you in terms of what support do you need? What professionals would be helpful for you? What do these concepts mean to you? Do you need forgiveness? What does closure mean to you? If it means anything to you, kind of looking at those concepts instead of forcing yourself to remember things and letting the process kind of work itself out.
Thank you, Nicola. And Ralph, what advice would you give to someone who is just beginning to explore and address their own repressed trauma?
Well, ditto with what was said before, but also I've been involved with men's support groups. I'm still co-chair of one at VSC. And I hear a lot, from people that, I got this, I can handle this. No, you can't. And it's not the same for everybody. But therapy is so important. And I tell people that I talk to is that make sure you click with this person. because I've also heard stories where it's like this. I've been with this therapist for 6 months and it's just not doing it. Well, change the therapist. Not that she's or he is a bad person. It's just that you're not clicking with them, because that shouldn't be an answer to that question, where you need to find someone that you can trust, that you feel that you can open up and tell them everything. And boy, that's a biggie when you've been through what we've been through, to be able to talk to someone. And it's the most hardest thing you'll ever do in your life, probably. But therapy, therapy, therapy. It's the fix. It works. And not just for me. I know it's worked for a lot of other people, but just make sure it's on the right path. Make sure, and therapy might not be good for you right now, where you're still so vulnerable, but then just talk to someone. Pick up the 24/7 hotline, 407-500-HEAL, and just talk. You don't have to tell them your name. You don't have to say who you are. You can tell them anything. They're not going to know you. They don't see your face, whatever. But do something, because doing nothing leads to bad things.
Wow. Nicola and Ralph, this was such an amazing episode. Thank you so much for teaching me. Like, this was literally during this entire recording, I'm like, wow, here I am learning about repressed trauma. And also, Nicola, regarding betrayal trauma, that's up next. So, Ralph and Nicola, thank you again.
Nicola should be a professor, by the way.
I think so too. The way that she
do.
explains things is just so easy to understand and easy to process. So thank you both so much. I appreciate you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah.
The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free, confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. The views and opinions expressed by podcast participants are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. This podcast content is made available for informational and educational purposes, and the VSC does not make any representation or warranties with respect to the accuracy or completeness of the content. While we make every effort to ensure that the information we are sharing is accurate, we welcome any comments, suggestions, or correction of errors. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear and you are not alone.